Welcome to The Concise Consultant. This series of short lecturettes covers some of the main skills needed to work effectively as a management consultant. Hello, my name is Calvert Markham. I'm a management consultant, but for much of my career I've designed and delivered training and consulting skills for individuals and organizations around the world. As part of this work, some years ago I recorded a series of interviews with the broadcaster Michael Bartlett on various topics in consultancy. We called it The Concise Consultant. I've now added some graphics to these interviews. We cover 4 topics. Consultancy and dealing with clients, in which we look at the context in which consultancy is performed. How to deliver consultancy services, which is at the core of a consultant's work. Selling consultancy services, which is essential for anyone working in a consulting practice. And managing the consultancy business, which looks at some of the peculiar challenges involved. This is the second of the series and deals with how to deliver consultancy services. Consultants must achieve results within tight constraints of time and money. The environment in which they do this can be very challenging, particularly if change is involved, so they need a robust approach to carrying out their work. I hope you enjoy this lecturette and find it useful. Now over to Michael Bartlett.
OK, I've decided I'm a consultant, I have a body of knowledge to share, I know my subject, but how do I start delivering that knowledge to clients?
Well, lots of different ways that you can deliver knowledge, for example by giving advice. So what's the best wine to have with this type of cheese? That's a piece of advice, isn't it? It could be through a retainer, it could be by being a non-executive director, you could be what's called an interim executive, but for the most part consultants deliver value to their clients through the medium of conducting projects.
Well, most of the people listening to this tape will have come across projects before, so what's special about a consultancy project?
Well, in many ways, the rules are exactly the same as elsewhere. In other words, you have to create a project plan, you have to monitor how things are going, and then you have to take action to put things right if they're not going right. A useful principle to remember here is what we call the 20-80 rule. In other words, that 20% of causes account for something like 80% of the effects. It's often known as Pareto's principle. And what you need to do in any project is to say, what are the really important things that we've got to achieve on this project? Who are the really important people to convince? What are the really difficult areas of technical risk, say? And pay particular attention to those. But there are some important differences between conventional projects and consultancy projects. The first thing is, of course, consultancy is intangible. And when you start a consultancy project, one of the key elements to manage is client confidence. Because the project is intangible, then how does the client know what's going on? And although you may start with a credit balance of trust and confidence from a client, that needs to be nurtured. So confidence-building measures are very important at the start of the project to reassure the client that things are going on as planned. The second important thing to remember is that the project is a client's project. You're simply there to assist them in the implementation of that project or the conduct of that project. And to that end, it's important that what you do is incorporated into the client's management structure. And a simple rule here to remember is that as well as having a project team that may involve client staff, it's important to have a management reporting process through perhaps to a steering group or steering committee of client staff who are taking overall responsibility for the project. It is a client project and there should be a management responsibility within the client for making sure that it's successful.
Well, where does quality come into all this?
Well, one of the definitions of quality is that quality is conformance with specification. Now, I said a moment ago that consultancy is intangible. So you can't say how long is it, what colour should it be, and so on, in the way that you could with a physical product. And the way that consultancy is designed is through this thing that I call terms of reference. I've already said something about this in the earlier section, but briefly at this point it's worth saying that the product design happens during the sales process in consultancy. Now, often what you find in a consultancy practice is that the people who sell the consultancy project are different from the people who actually conduct it. And in that separation, you could have all sorts of communication difficulties. In other words, the salespeople think they've sold one thing, the client thinks he's bought another thing, and the people who are actually delivering the project deliver a third thing. So there's bags of opportunity for things to go wrong. And so one of the steps that's quite important to take at this stage is to make sure that some of the delivery team are involved with the sales process so they know what's been promised to the client, and if they're a technical expert, they can assess whether or not this is possible to do or whether the salesman has promised the impossible.
Calvert, what do you actually do in a consultancy project?
Well, every consultancy project consists of 3 stages: a kick-off stage, the main bit, and the completion, the beginning, the middle, and the end of every project. What happens in the kick-off? Well, that's the start of the consultancy project. You may actually have a team meeting. The team may consist of all consultants, or it may be a mixture of consultant and client staff. If it's a significant project or a large team, you may be wanting to do some team building work with that group. You may want to train client staff in particular techniques. You certainly will want to communicate to the client at large what's going to be happening. There needs to be some sort of expectation set about what the project's going to be about, and some people may have some concerns or misapprehensions that need to be allayed. During the execution of the project, and this is something we're going to be talking about in a bit more detail in a moment, you're going to be collecting and analysing information, deciding what has to be done. And then the completion stage is taking action on what you've found and drawing the project to a conclusion.
You mentioned that a key part of the work was collecting and analysing information. How do you decide what you need to know?
Well, it does depend on the nature of the problem that you're seeking to address in the first place. There are broadly 2 types of problem that you're going to be dealing with in consultancy. That which is well-defined, and so you're seeking a solution to a clear problem. And the second type is where you're not even sure what the problem is in the first place. And you need 2 types of data collection to go with that. So if you're talking about a well-defined problem, then you're going to be fairly clear what sort of data you're going to need to work out what the solution is. On the other hand, if you're talking about an ill-defined problem, you may have to adopt a more exploratory approach because you don't know what you don't know because you don't know it. And so you have then to do some digging around to find out what's going on.
Can you just give me a couple of examples of that?
Well, an example of a well-defined problem is, how do we go about speeding up this production process? So it's fairly clear what you're meant to be doing. You've got to speed up the production process. What the client's expecting is something that's going to deliver some sort of faster process at the end of the project. An example of an ill-defined problem is, how should we go about dealing with Pacific economies over the next 10 years? It's not at all clear what that problem is. Should we actually be starting a factory in China? Should we be aiming to market rather better in New Zealand? What exactly is the problem? And so that's an example of an ill-defined problem.
In general terms, how do you get the information you want?
Well, you've first of all got to decide where you're going to get it from, and there may be information that's available within the client. It may be that there's information available outside the client, or it may well be that there's a certain amount of analysis that's needed for information that the client has, but hasn't looked at in a particular way. The ways in which you get information broadly fall into 4 categories. What happens is you meet people, you have meetings, interviews, face-to-face type of activity. Secondly, you might have questionnaires of one kind or another, forms that people fill in. A third way is by looking at documentation or computer-based information that a client has. And finally, there's just looking around. My first job was as a production consultant, and one of the things you learned as a production consultant was work study. And part of work study is actually just observing people and timing how much time it takes them to do things. It's one of the few jobs in the world where you're actually paid to watch other people work. There are a couple of important things, though, to think about when you're considering data collection as a consultant. The first thing is that whenever you ask a question, that has an impact on the client system. So, for example, if I'm a remuneration consultant and I'm interviewing you as a member of client staff about pay, and I say to you, would you be interested in a new bonus scheme? Immediately you're going to think that the management are thinking of introducing a new bonus scheme. The second thing is that you need to have thought beforehand what you're going to use this data for. And to that end, it's useful to have some ideas that you're using the data to explore, what we call in our business some hypotheses, which you're seeking to check out by the data that you've collected. And a proven hypothesis is a conclusion. By the end of your data collection exercise, you should have come to some firm conclusions.
Calvert, I've heard a consultant defined as an agent of change. Presumably, once you've come to some conclusions, you have to do something with the client to effect change.
Well, of course, different clients are at different states of readiness for change. And one of the things it's useful to check out even before starting a project is how ready an organization is for change. And of course, during the course of a project, you need to be helping that client be ready for the changes that you might be recommending at the end of that project. So it shouldn't come as a sudden surprise, whatever it is that you're going to be recommending. It is important when you're thinking about what you're going to be suggesting to a client to make sure there's not just technically correct, but that it is something that they are going to be able to go with. In other words, it's acceptable to them and it's something that they can happily implement. Beyond this, when we're thinking about change, the key thing is turning resistance to commitment. If I want to be successful in change, I've really got to get the commitment of client staff to it.
Well, it's all very well talking about commitment, but what about all this downsizing in recent years? I guess in some cases getting commitment must be like getting turkeys to vote for Christmas.
Well, it can be very difficult. Consultants don't really have much power to implement change. And that's why I've made the point that projects are client projects. It's the client that has the power, not the consultant. So a consultant can't make things happen. They can only work through the client. And of course, it's difficult to get people to act against their own best interest. So obviously you have to handle some of these changes very sensitively. And inevitably, if there is some downsizing, this has to be done carefully because, of course, you've got the people who are left behind, what we sometimes call the survivors, to think about and thinking about their morale, and that's going to depend on how well downsizing was being handled. The traditional argument has always been that if it's a choice between survival and losing, say, 10% of the staff, then it's far better to go ahead with 90% of the people than none of the people. It's the job of the consultant, really, to facilitate the whole process of change. And there's some things it's useful to think about beforehand. Number one is, do people want to change in the first place? If they're perfectly happy with the way things are, then they won't want to change. But even if they do want to change and they can sense the need for it, it's important to give them some sort of idea about how things might be different, some sort of vision of the future. And finally, even though they may be discontent of where they are, and very clear where they want to get to, it may not be at all clear how they're going to get from A to B, and it's the consultant's job then to show how that might be achieved.
All this sounds a bit theoretical. Can you offer some practical tips about handling major change?
Yes, I can, but I think they have to come with a health warning. The subject of change is an enormously large one, and all I can do is give some pointers, I guess. And I think I've got 5 that I'd like to run through with you, Michael. I think, firstly, I'd say top management has visibly to be backing a change. For example, what do senior people go around praising? And if it's what used to be the case, then it means that you're not going to be successful in achieving change. There's an old phrase, isn't there? If you always do what you've always done, you always get what you always got. The second point is that you have to remember that people's response to change depends entirely on how they see it. And their response is going to be not just rational, but it's going to be emotional as well, and based on perception. And so you need jolly good communications to make sure that people know what's going on. And the third point also involves communication, but that's communication the other direction. Let people influence change as far as possible. Because if people have decided what they need and want, then they're going to be far more committed to change than otherwise. The fourth point is, if you're going to be successful in achieving major change, you've got to give the right resources to it. And that means time. It may mean improved communication systems. It may mean management priorities, and so on. And the final point is you can be wrong. As a consultant, you don't know everything, and quite often when you go into change, you're going along a learning curve. You have to think, well, we've got so far, but now we have to actually rethink exactly what we're going to be doing next.
You spoke about communication. I guess that's a pretty important skill for a consultant.
Absolutely. If we go back to my original definition of a consultant, which is delivering specialist skills in a client environment, client communications are really important. And they're going to be written or they're going to be oral. And so you're going to have proposals, progress reviews, assignment reports. You may be running training courses, workshops and seminars. All those need good communication skills on the part of the consultant. Now, of course, there are hosts of writing courses and presentation skills courses around the place. And the skills are well known. I suppose if I wanted to make a single point on this, it would be don't confuse the journey with the destination. Communication is a means and not an end. You need, whenever you're writing a report or producing a presentation, to think very carefully, why am I doing this? What do I want to be different at the end of all this? And use that then to inform the medium and the content of what you're putting across.
And at the end of the project, Calvert?
Well, there's a lot of talk nowadays about learning organisations. And if you think about consultancy, it's very much about the application of know-how. A key strategic question, I guess, for all consultancies is how do we get the experience of the individual and make sure that it's corporately available? You know, there's a story about goldfish. They have a memory span of about 3 seconds. And so when that little goldfish is going around the goldfish bowl, we may think it's getting very bored. But believe me, by the time it gets round to that little bridge, it's jolly excited because it's the first time it's seen it. It's forgotten it. It went past it 3 seconds ago. And you find that there are organisations which display goldfish mentality. What happens is they keep on making the same mistakes simply because the people who've got the experience haven't shared it with others. And so at the end of the project, a very important stage is that of review. What did we learn on this project and what's going to be useful for our practice as a whole?
That completes this session on how to deliver consultancy services. Here's what we covered. How do I deliver my knowledge to clients? What's so special about a consulting project? Where does quality fit in? What do you do in a consulting project? How do you decide what data to collect? How do you get the information you want? What do you need to do to effect change? How do you get commitment? Practical tips on handling change. What about communication skills? And what about the end of the project? In this short session, we have only touched on these topics. If you want to know more, you may like to take a look at some of my other publications or at further training. I'll be giving details on each of these in a moment, but on the topic of how to deliver consultancy services, you'll find that practical management consultancy is particularly useful. Practical management consultancy should be really helpful to those who are recent recruits to management consultancy, as well as a useful refresher to more experienced consultants who want to revisit the basics. The core of the book is a detailed treatment of the consultancy delivery process, which I have called the consult process, and which consists of 5 stages. Entry, in which you establish a relationship with a client. Contracting, agreeing what you're going to do and how you do it. Diagnosis, in which you gather information and work out how the client's situation is to be addressed. Intervention, where you work with a client to put your solutions in place, and closure, completion of the project and withdrawal. This is supported by chapters on the supporting techniques that consultants need in their tool bag, for example, report writing and problem solving. Finally, there are chapters on contextual matters, commercial aspects, and working in a consulting practice. The top consultant addresses the skills required of more experienced management consultants and has a more commercial edge than practical management consultancy, covering, for example, managing a consultancy business, product definition and marketing in consultancy, the consultancy sales process, consultancy problem solving, and commercial aspects of consultancy. Joe Omani wrote the first edition of Management Consultancy in 2010. Over the many years I've been teaching consultants and students, this is by far the best critical examination of management consultancy and the various aspects of it. It is a truly excellent book for students of the subject. I therefore had no hesitation in making this the set book for the courses I've run at MSc and MBA levels. I was therefore delighted when Joe asked me to contribute to the second edition in 2013. I added only a little to what was already a very comprehensive book, but Joe's been kind enough to cite me as the second author. There are 4 perspectives covered in the book. Descriptive, outlining what consultancy is and its business. Practitioner, setting out the practicalities of delivering consultancy and the commercial aspects of it. Critical, setting out the challenges for institutions and individuals in consultancy. And career, which is of interest to the many students who are considering the possibility of becoming a management consultant. All these books are available on Amazon. In a different medium, you may like to take a look at Henry Stewart Talks, which are in a format similar to the one you've just seen. The series on management consultancy contains a number of lectures by academics on contemporary issues. I've contributed one on the consulting project cycle. Finally, there are lots of training courses available for consultants, and so it would be remiss of me not to refer you to those run by the company that I founded, now called Elevation Learning. Their suite of courses includes core skill programs, covering the essential skills needed in any consultancy business, in-depth skills for consultants going beyond the core skills, developing competence in aspects of the consulting process, working with clients, and commercial skills. And finally, managers may find themselves thrust into a consulting role as internal consultants, or technical specialists such as engineers may need consulting skills to work effectively with clients. Internal service deliverers such as HR and IT need these skills if they are to provide excellent service to their in-house clients. Courses in engagement skills for technical specialists and internal consultants will help them to perform well in all these roles. You can see all these courses and others on the Elevation Learning website. There are, of course, many other resources available to both beginners in consultancy and experienced practitioners. Thank you for your attention.